The funeral for Mrs. Cobb was 3 days later. Turner wrote out Mrs. Cobb's last words and gave them to his father, who put them in his front coat pocket, still folded. The whole congregation watched the paper in his pocket during the prayer for peace. They watched it while Lillian Woodward droned the hymns. They watched it while Reverend Buckminster delivered the eulogy. And they watched it when he removed it from his pocket and held it out to them. Such has been the beauty of this saint-like life. Such has been the glory of her passing. And at the moment of death, there can be no greater testimony to the Christian life than the final words of the dearly departed. Turner was sweating enough to wilt even his starched shirt. Reverend Buckminster unfolded the paper. It was upside down, and he turned it over slowly. Slight laughter from the congregation. Turner sweated in places he didn't think he could sweat. Reverend Buckminster was silent and still. "Read it aloud, Reverend," said Mr. Stonecrop. Reverend Buckminster cleared his throat. He cleared it again. It's quite short," he said. Murmurs in the congregation. Turner felt sweat dripping into his eyes. Reverend Buckminster cleared his throat again. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," he said. "Oh," from the congregation, disappointed. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." Well, who's going to bother remembering that? Turner heard behind him. "Let us turn to hymn 118, announced Reverend Buckminster. He looked pointedly down at Turner. "Amazing Grace." And when the sweet sounds of that hymn were finished, the pallbearers carried Mrs. Cobb's casket down the center aisle, followed by the minister and his wife, Turner a good deal behind them, and then the rest of the congregation. She was buried with her people in the cemetery behind First Congregational, straight in front of the headstone that marked the family plot, not far from her grandfather of the perfect picket fence. It was snowing again, and the air was so sharp and cold that most of the congregation, having already shown proper respect by coming to the funeral service, and having been disappointed by the resolution of the mystery of her last words, went home before the burial. But Turner stood by the graveside along with his mother and father. "Perhaps," said Deacon Hurd as he finished the final prayer, "you might say her last words once more, Reverend." Another clearing of the minister's throat. "I think a holy silence might best become her," he said, and bowed his head. When the committal was over, Turner told his parents he would stay to help the grave digger. "No need for that," said his mother. "I think she might like me to be here," said Turner, looking at his father. "No need for that," said old Mr. Thayer, who had dug more graves for more years than he cared to count. "I think she might like me to be here," said Turner, still looking at his father. He stayed, and when old Mr. Thayer began to fill in the grave, Turner took the shovel from him and filled in most of it himself. He was almost done when Lizzie appeared from out of the woods. "I think she might like me to be here," she said, and Turner handed her the shovel. "That does beat all," said old Mr. Thayer, and he watched Lizzie fill in the grave and pat the cold earth tightly over Mrs. Cobb. Turner and Lizzie stood by the grave as he gathered his tools and laughed, shaking his head. Together they said, "I have some friends before me gone." "Your daddy read the last words?" "He read them." "He say them out loud?" "No, he said something else." "You're not supposed to lie about someone's last words." "She won't mind." Lizzie reached down and smoothed the bulge of the grave. "Plant some violets here in the spring," she said. "We'll plant them together." But she shook her head. "Turner, look at things straight on, the way they're going to be." She stood up suddenly, then ran, twisting through the stones, leaving Turner alone beside the grave. Before he walked home, he went past Mrs. Cobb's house and leaned against her grandfather's fence. He could almost hear his own organ music coming out, and he gripped the pickets so hard that he could feel them real and solid, things that had lasted a good long time and would probably last a good deal longer. Even when he could no longer hear the music, he could feel the pickets in his hands, the wood covered with layer after layer of whitewash, standing guard around the house for who knew how many winters. Past the fence, the house stood straight and ruled as it had for 2 centuries, maybe more. It seemed as solid as the granite on which it was built, and Turner marveled that it could still be so after Mrs. Cobb had gone. Turner didn't know if he should be comforted because the house still stood, or afraid because it didn't care, or both. 3 days later, he had another reason to think of Mrs. Cobb's house.